The American highway is a river of asphalt that flows through a forgotten world. It cuts through vast deserts, dense forests, and empty plains, places where the veil between our reality and something else feels perilously thin. Truckers, the solitary guardians of this domain, spend thousands of hours staring into that void. They see things. Most of what they see can be explained away. Fatigue-induced hallucinations, tricks of the light, the strange behavior of people on the fringes of society. But not always. Sometimes a driver witnesses something so profoundly strange, so utterly contrary to the laws of nature and logic, that it cannot be dismissed. These are the moments that burn into the mind, leaving a permanent question mark on their understanding of the world. Today, we are venturing into the heart of that mystery. These are not simple ghost stories or tales of roadside criminals. These are 5 true, deeply disturbing accounts from truckers who saw something they were never meant to see, something they still can't explain. Story 1. The Road That Wasn't There. Our first story comes from a veteran driver named Al, a man who had been crisscrossing the country since the 1980s. Al was a master of his trade, a human GPS who knew the interstate system and its thousands of state highway offshoots like the back of his hand. In the fall of 2002, he was hauling a load of lumber through the remote mountainous region of eastern Nevada, an area known for its vast, empty valleys and long, lonely stretches of 2-lane blacktop. It was on one of these forgotten highways, under a sky bruised with the colors of a dying sunset, that Al's map of the world was irrevocably rewritten. He was running behind schedule due to an unexpected closure on his primary route. His dispatcher, eager to make up time, had given him an alternate route, a series of state highways that cut through the heart of the desert. It was a route Al had never taken before. He was navigating with a combination of his dispatcher's directions and a well-worn paper road atlas. According to the map, he was supposed to take a right turn onto a smaller state road, SR 319, in about 5 miles. As he drove, the landscape grew increasingly desolate. The sun dipped below the mountains, plunging the valley into a deep purple twilight. The road stretched out before him, a narrow ribbon of asphalt disappearing into the gloom. Right on schedule, he saw the turnoff ahead. A simple, weathered green sign read SR 319. It was exactly where the map said it would be. Without a second thought, Al slowed his rig, flicked on his turn signal, and made the wide, careful turn onto the new road. The moment his wheels hit the new asphalt, something felt wrong. The road was in perfect condition, impossibly perfect. The asphalt was smooth, black and freshly paved, with crisp, bright white lines. There were no cracks, no potholes, no faded markings. It was the kind of pristine road you'd expect in a new suburban development, not in the middle of the Nevada desert. Al frowned. State funding must have finally come through for this forgotten corner of the world, he thought. He drove on. The road was straight, cutting a perfect line through the sagebrush. But as the miles rolled by, a deep, creeping unease began to settle over him. There were no other cars, not a single pair of headlights coming or going. There were no signs of life, no ranch houses, no cattle guards, no power lines. The road itself had no other markings, no mile markers, no warning signs for curves, nothing. It was just a perfect, silent, black ribbon. The strangest thing was the silence. Al always drove with his CB radio on, a constant companion. But since turning onto SR 319, it had been completely dead. Not even static. Just a profound, unnerving silence, as if the very air was incapable of carrying a signal. He checked his cell phone. No service. That was expected out here, but combined with the dead radio and the perfect road, it added to the growing sense of profound isolation. After about 20 minutes, which he estimated to be about 15 miles, he knew something was terribly wrong. According to his atlas, SR 319 was supposed to be a winding road that followed the contour of the mountains. It should have intersected with another small county road by now. But the road before him remained perfectly, unnaturally straight. It was as if he were driving on a line drawn by a ruler. He slowed the truck, his eyes scanning the darkness on either side of the road. The sagebrush and desert scrub looked normal, but the road itself felt alien, like it didn't belong here. It felt like a scar, a piece of some other place grafted onto the desert landscape. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle at him. He was lost. But how? The turnoff had been clearly marked. The road was real. He was driving on it. He made a decision. He had to turn back. Continuing down this strange, featureless road felt like driving towards a cliff. He found a spot where the shoulder was wide enough and began the slow, difficult process of turning his 75-foot rig around. As his headlights swung across the desert during the turn, they illuminated the sign he had passed at the turnoff. It was still there, a lone green rectangle in the darkness, but now, as his lights hit it from the new angle, he could see that the sign was blank. There was no SR 319. No lettering at all, just a blank, weathered green sign. A jolt of pure terror went through him. He finished the turn, his heart hammering against his ribs, and stomped on the accelerator. He was no longer just trying to get back en route. He was fleeing. He drove back down the impossibly straight, perfect road, his eyes locked on the horizon, praying for the familiar sight of the main highway. He drove for 20 minutes, the same amount of time it had taken him to drive in. But the main highway didn't appear. He drove for 30 minutes, then 40. The road remained unchanged, a perfect, black, silent void. The panic inside him was growing into a full-blown, screaming hysteria. It felt like the road was stretching, like he was trapped on a treadmill, driving endlessly, but going nowhere. The fuel gauge, which had been over half full, was now dipping towards a quarter. He was burning fuel, the engine was running, the wheels were turning, but he was making no progress. Just as he was about to lose his mind completely, just as he was about to stop the truck in the middle of the road and break down, he saw it. A faint flicker of light on the horizon. The headlights of another vehicle. A wave of relief so profound it almost made him weep washed over him. He wasn't alone. He flashed his high beams, and the other vehicle flashed back. It was the main highway. He had made it back. He hit the intersection, his tires screeching as he made the turn, not even looking to see if the blank green sign was still there. He didn't want to know. The moment his rig was back on the familiar cracked asphalt of the main highway, his CB radio exploded to life with a burst of static and chatter. His cell phone chimed, indicating it had found a signal. The world had returned to normal. He drove for another hour before he felt safe enough to pull over. He sat in his cab, shaking, trying to process what had just happened. He grabbed his road atlas, his hands trembling. He found the spot where he had turned. There was SR 319, clearly marked, but then he saw something else. A small note in the margin, one he hadn't noticed before. It was a revision note from the publisher. SR 319 decommissioned 1978. Road no longer exists. The blood drained from his face. The road he had just spent over an hour on, the road that had almost swallowed him, hadn't existed for over 20 years. Al never told his company what happened. He called his dispatcher, said he had gotten lost, and apologized for the delay and the extra fuel he had burned. He couldn't explain the truth. How could he? That he had turned onto a phantom road, a road that shouldn't be there, a road that seemed to exist outside of normal space and time. He had driven on a ghost of the past, an echo of asphalt that had lured him into its strange, silent reality. He never took that route again, and to this day, he is haunted by the memory of that perfect, black, silent road, and the terrifying knowledge that not all places on the map are real, and not all real places are on the map. Story 2. The Faceless Audience. In the world of trucking, there are drivers who haul goods, And there are drivers who haul people. This story comes from the latter, a tour bus driver named Miguel, who in 2015 was working for a charter company based out of El Paso, Texas. His job was to ferry tourists, sports teams, and church groups across the vast, empty landscapes of West Texas and New Mexico. It was a job he loved, a constant stream of new faces and new destinations. But one night, on a charter for a group he never met, he became the unwilling performer in a silent, terrifying show for an audience that wasn't there. The job was unusual from the start. It was a last-minute booking from a corporate client Miguel had never heard of. The instructions were specific and strange. He was to pick up a group of 40 passengers at a remote, private airfield outside of Marfa, Texas, at 11 p.m. He was to drive them directly to another private airfield in New Mexico, a journey of about 4 hours. He was explicitly instructed not to speak to the passengers. He was told they were international executives who would be tired from a long flight and would wish to sleep. The bus was to be kept dark, with only the dimmest aisle lights on. Miguel was a professional. Strange requests weren't unheard of in the charter business. He prepped his luxury coach, a gleaming modern machine, and drove out to the airfield. The place was little more than a landing strip and a small windowless hangar in the middle of the Chihuahuan desert. It was an eerie, isolated spot. At exactly 11 p.m., a sleek, unmarked private jet landed, its engines a low whine in the desert silence. The jet taxied to the hangar when the air stair lowered. Miguel watched as the passengers began to file out and board his bus. They were all dressed identically in simple, dark, well-tailored suits. They moved in a strange, uniform silence, their faces obscured by the darkness. None of them spoke. None of them made eye contact with him. They simply filed onto the bus, took their seats, and stared straight ahead. Within minutes, all 40 seats were filled. The last person to board, a tall man who seemed to be in charge, paused at the front of the bus. He didn't look at Miguel, but simply said, in a low, monotone voice, "You have your instructions. Do not deviate. Do not stop." Then he took his seat. Miguel, though unnerved by the group's bizarre behavior, pulled the bus onto the dark highway. As instructed, he kept the main cabin lights off. The only light came from the glow of his dashboard and the faint blue emergency lights along the aisle. He glanced in the large rearview mirror that gave him a view of the entire cabin. All 40 passengers were sitting perfectly still, their heads facing forward, their forms silhouetted against the dim light. It was like driving a bus full of statues. The first hour of the drive was silent and tense. The complete lack of any sound from his 40 passengers was deeply unsettling. No coughs, no whispers, no rustling of clothing, no shifting in seats. Just absolute, profound silence. The air in the bus felt heavy, stagnant. It was during the second hour, on a long, straight stretch of road, that Miguel first noticed it. He glanced in his rearview mirror, and for a split second, the passing headlights of a lone oncoming car illuminated the cabin. In that brief flash of light, he saw their faces, and his heart stopped. They had no faces. Like the trucker in the Arizona desert, what Miguel saw was a smooth, pale, featureless expanse where their eyes, noses, and mouths should have been. It was a bus full of 40 identical blank mannequins, all dressed in dark suits, all sitting perfectly upright. He snapped his eyes back to the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. It was a trick of the light. It had to be. A reflection, a strange shadow, his mind playing tricks on him in the dark. He didn't dare look back in the mirror. He focused on the road, on the white lines, on his breathing, trying to convince himself he had imagined it. But he couldn't ignore the feeling of being watched, not by 40 pairs of eyes, but by 40 blank presences. It was a cold, clinical, observant feeling, like a scientist studying an insect. He felt a bead of sweat trace a cold path down his temple. He drove for another hour, his mind a screaming vortex of terror and denial. He had to look again. He had to know. He braced himself, took a deep breath, and flicked his eyes up to the rearview mirror. The cabin was dark, the passengers just silhouettes. He waited, his heart pounding for another car to pass. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Finally, he saw headlights approaching in the distance. He held his breath. The car passed, its lights sweeping through the cabin for a fraction of a second. He saw it again. 40 smooth, white, featureless ovals, all angled slightly, as if they had all turned their heads to look directly at him in the mirror at the exact same moment. A strangled gasp escaped his lips. This was not a trick of the light. This was real. He was trapped in a moving metal tube with 40 impossible, terrifying things. His instructions echoed in his head. Do not deviate. Do not stop. It wasn't a request. It was a warning. What would happen if he did stop? What were these things? Where was he taking them? His mind raced. Were they aliens, androids, some kind of government experiment? The corporate client, the private airfields, the secrecy. It all clicked into place in the most horrifying way. He was a courier, a delivery driver for something that was not human. The final hour of the drive was the purest form of torture Miguel had ever experienced. He could feel their collective, silent gaze on the back of his head. The air in the bus grew cold, and a faint, almost imperceptible hum seemed to emanate from the cabin behind him, a low-level vibration that he could feel in his teeth. He felt like a specimen under a microscope, his every action, his every heartbeat being observed and recorded by the silent, faceless audience behind him. He finally saw the lights of the private airfield in New Mexico. He had never been so relieved to see a destination in his life. He pulled the bus to a stop next to another unmarked hangar, his hands shaking so badly he could barely put the vehicle in park. The moment the bus stopped, the passengers began to move. In the same uniform, silent manner in which they had boarded, they stood up and began to file out of the bus. They moved without a sound, their feet making no noise on the steps. As they passed him, he kept his eyes fixed on the steering wheel, not daring to look at their blank faces. The tall man who had given him his instructions was the last to get off. He paused at the door. "Your service is complete," the man's monotone voice said from the doorway. "A payment has been wired to your company. You will forget this journey. You will forget us." Then he was gone. Miguel sat there, trembling, as another unmarked private jet, identical to the first, taxied to the hangar. He watched as the 40 silent, dark-suited figures boarded the plane. The jet took off, its engines a piercing scream in the night, and vanished into the darkness. Miguel drove the empty bus back to El Paso in a daze. When he got back, he saw that the payment had indeed been wired. It was a sum 5 times the normal rate for such a charter. It was hush money. He tried to forget. He tried to convince himself it was a dream, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But he couldn't. The memory was too vivid, too real. The sight of those 40 blank, identical faces, all turning to look at him in the mirror, was burned into his mind. He quit his job a week later. He couldn't bear the thought of looking into that rearview mirror ever again, terrified of what he might see looking back at him. He never learned what those things were or where he took them, but he lives with the chilling certainty that humanity is not alone, and that sometimes a bus driver is just a chauffeur for the things that live in the shadows. Story 3. The Glitch in the Matrix. The life of a trucker is governed by time and distance. Their reality is a constant linear progression from point A to point B. A to B, B to C. The road unspools before them in a predictable, measurable way. But what happens when that line breaks? What happens when time itself seems to skip, to loop, to glitch? This story comes from a driver named Kevin, and it's not about a monster or a ghost, but about something far more unsettling. a moment when the fabric of reality itself seemed to tear open on a lonely stretch of highway in the Florida Panhandle. In 2018, Kevin was hauling a load of paper goods from Jacksonville to Pensacola along I-10. It was a routine, overnight run he had made hundreds of times. The stretch of Interstate 10 that cuts through the Apalachicola National Forest is notoriously dark and isolated. It's a straight, flat road surrounded by miles of dense, swampy pine forest. At 2 a.m., it feels like the edge of the world. Kevin was feeling good. He was ahead of schedule, listening to a podcast and sipping a lukewarm coffee. The road was empty. He settled in for the long, monotonous stretch through the forest. As he drove, he noticed a set of headlights approaching from the opposite direction. It was another semi-truck. As it got closer, he saw that it was a distinctive, bright yellow Volvo with a silver tanker trailer. It was a memorable rig. The two trucks passed each other with a familiar whoosh of air, and Kevin watched the yellow truck's taillights disappear in his rearview mirror. He continued driving, the podcast droning on. About 10 minutes later, he looked up and saw a pair of headlights approaching in the distance. As the vehicle got closer, a strange sense of déjà vu washed over him. It was another semi-truck, a bright yellow Volvo with a silver tanker trailer. Kevin frowned. It was a coincidence, he thought. Volvo is a popular make, and yellow is a common color for a fleet. Still, it was odd to see two identical, distinctive rigs so close together on such an empty stretch of road. He watched as the truck passed him. It was exactly the same as the first one. The same company logo on the door, one he didn't recognize. The same configuration of lights, the same silver tanker. The driver, a silhouetted figure, gave him a brief, anonymous wave, just as the first driver had. A little unsettled, Kevin kept driving. He tried to shake off the weird feeling, focusing on his podcast. But the sense of unease lingered. The forest outside seemed darker, the road more oppressive. 10 minutes later, it happened again. The same headlights, the same approach, the same bright yellow Volvo, the same silver tanker, the same whoosh of air as it passed, the same silhouetted driver, the same wave. Kevin's blood ran cold. This was not a coincidence. This was impossible. He hadn't passed any exits. There was no way for the truck to have turned around and gotten ahead of him again, not once, let alone twice. He was on a straight, linear highway. He grabbed his CB mic, his hand slick with sweat. "Hey, any drivers on I-10 eastbound, west of Tallahassee?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Did anyone else just see that yellow Volvo tanker?" The same one, over and over. The radio was silent. He was talking to himself. He was now terrified, but also morbidly curious. He kept his eyes glued to the road ahead, waiting. The minutes ticked by, each one an eternity. And then, like clockwork, 10 minutes after the last one, the headlights appeared on the horizon. It was the yellow truck. This time, as it approached, Kevin slowed his rig, peering intently at the other driver. He wanted to see his face, to see if it was a real person, but as the truck drew level with his cab, he saw that the driver's side window was black, impossibly dark, as if it were tinted with a film that absorbed all light. He couldn't see anything inside. The truck passed, and Kevin watched in his mirror as its taillights receded and vanished. He was in a state of near panic. Was he losing his mind? Was he having a stroke? Was he asleep at the wheel and dreaming this whole thing? He pinched his own arm hard. The sharp sting of pain was real. He was awake. This was happening. He waited for the next 10-minute interval, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He had to do something different. He couldn't just let it pass again. As the 10-minute mark approached, he saw the familiar headlights materialize out of the darkness. This time, Kevin laid on his air horn, a deafening, continuous blast that shattered the silence of the night. He flashed his high beams on and off, trying to break the pattern, to force a different reaction. The yellow truck did not react. It continued its steady approach, its speed unchanged. It didn't flash its lights back. It didn't honk its horn. It just came on, a silent, implacable phantom. As it passed, Kevin stared again at the blacked-out driver's window, but this time, in the split second the cab was illuminated by his own headlights, he saw something, a shape. Inside the dark cab, he saw a figure, but it wasn't a person. It was a tall, impossibly thin black silhouette, a shape that was too long and angular to be human. It was like a shard of pure darkness sitting behind the wheel. Kevin screamed. He yanked his steering wheel, his truck swerving onto the shoulder, kicking up dirt and gravel. He brought the rig to a shuddering halt and killed the engine. He sat there in the sudden, ringing silence, hyperventilating, his body drenched in cold sweat. He didn't know how long he sat there. Maybe an hour, maybe more. He didn't see the yellow truck again. Eventually, another truck, a normal one, passed him, its driver giving him a concerned blast on the CB to see if he was okay. The sound of another human voice was enough to break the spell. Frank told the other driver he had just been fighting off sleep. He started his truck and continued his journey, but the world felt different. It felt fragile, like a thin film stretched over something incomprehensible. He had experienced a break in the pattern, a glitch in the matrix. He had seen a loop, a moment in time replaying itself for reasons he could never understand. He later learned from old-timers that the stretch of I-10 through the Apalachicola forest has a strange reputation. They call it the Highway of Loops. Stories abound of drivers experiencing short periods of missing time, of seeing the same car pass them multiple times, of driving for an hour only to find themselves back where they started. Most dismiss it as highway hypnosis or fatigue. But Kevin knows what he saw. He saw a phantom truck driven by a shadow, caught in a 10-minute loop of eternity. It's a chilling reminder that time, like the road, may not always be a straight line, and that sometimes you can witness a moment when reality gets stuck on repeat. Story 4. The Whispering Vents. The sleeper cab of a semi-truck is a marvel of compact engineering. It's a bedroom, a kitchen, and a living room all packed into a space smaller than a prison cell. For a driver, it's a cocoon, a private world shielded from the noise and chaos of the road. But this tiny, enclosed space can also become a chamber of psychological horror. As a driver named Ben discovered one terrifying night at a truck stop in rural Pennsylvania in 2009. Ben was a young, tech-savvy trucker, a new breed of driver who relied on GPS, satellite radio, and his laptop to stay connected and sane on the long hauls. He was hauling a load of consumer electronics from a warehouse in New Jersey to a distribution center in Ohio. It was a cold, rainy November night, and he decided to shut down early at a large, well-known chain truck stop just off I-80. The place was packed, and he managed to find one of the last available spots in the back of the lot. He settled in for the night, firing up his laptop to watch a movie. The rain pattered a soothing rhythm on the roof of his cab, and the familiar hum of dozens of other idling trucks created a comforting white noise. He had his cab's climate control system running, the fan blowing a gentle stream of warm air through the vents, keeping the damp chill at bay. He was about halfway through his movie when he first heard it. A faint sound buried beneath the noise of the fan, the rain, and the other trucks. It was a whisper. He paused the movie and listened intently. The sound was gone. He figured it must have been a line of dialogue from the movie or his imagination. He pressed play. A few minutes later, he heard it again, clearer this time. It was a soft, sibilant whisper, and it seemed to be coming directly from the air vent next to his bunk. He muted the movie. The cab was filled with the low hum of the fan. He leaned closer to the vent, his ear just inches from the plastic grill, and then he heard it, plain as day. So cold. It was a woman's voice, thin and weak, like the sigh of a dying breath. It was followed by a soft, wet, rattling sound, like someone struggling to breathe through fluid-filled lungs. Ben recoiled from the vent as if he'd been burned, his heart hammered against his ribs. This was impossible. The truck's climate control system was a closed loop. It pulled air from outside, heated it, and blew it into the cab. There was no way for a voice to travel through it. It had to be the radio, picking up a stray signal. He checked his CB. It was off. His satellite radio was off. He sat there, frozen, listening. For a long time there was nothing but the hum of the fan. He was starting to convince himself he had imagined it, that he was more tired than he thought. He was about to turn his movie back on when the voice came again, this time more insistent, filled with a desperate, pleading quality. "Help me. I can't breathe. He put me here." The voice was undeniably coming from the vent. It was accompanied by that same horrifying, rattling breath. Ben felt a wave of nausea. He scrambled to the front of the cab and shut off the climate control system completely. The fan spun down, and the cab was plunged into a sudden, thick silence, broken only by the rain on the roof. He waited, his breath held, his ears straining in the quiet. The whispering was gone. But the silence was somehow worse. It felt heavy, charged with an unseen presence. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was not alone in the cab. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe the truck stop's Wi-Fi was somehow interfering with his speakers, creating auditory pareidolia, the brain's tendency to find patterns in random noise. It was a stretch, but it was better than the alternative. He decided to try to sleep it off. He climbed into his bunk, but he couldn't relax. He kept staring at the dark, silent air vent, his mind replaying the weak, desperate voice. He must have dozed off because he was suddenly awakened by a smell. A thick, cloying, metallic odor, the smell of old, dried blood. It was coming from the vents, and with the smell, the whispering returned, even though the fan was off. It was no longer pleading, it was angry. "Get out! My space! Get out!" The last two words were not a whisper, but a guttural shriek that seemed to explode from the vent, so loud it made his ears ring. At the same time, a blast of impossibly cold air shot out of the vent, hitting him in the face. It was a frigid, foul-smelling air that felt ancient and wrong. Ben screamed and threw himself out of the bunk, stumbling into the narrow space of the cab. He fumbled for the door handle and threw it open, tumbling out into the cold, rainy parking lot. He stood there in the rain, in his socks, shaking and gasping for air, staring at his own truck as if it were a monster. He didn't know what to do. He couldn't go back in there, but he couldn't just abandon his rig and its valuable cargo. After several minutes of standing in the rain, his terror slowly gave way to a desperate need for answers. He had to know what was going on. He remembered that the air intake for the cab's climate system was located in an exterior panel on the passenger side of the truck, just behind the cab. Armed with his flashlight, he cautiously approached the panel. It was a simple, grated cover, held in place by 4 screws. With trembling hands, he used a multi-tool from his glove box to undo the screws. The panel came away in his hand. He shone his flashlight into the dark space behind it. It was a small compartment that housed the air filter and the intake fan. It was supposed to be empty, save for the machinery. It was not empty. Wedged deep inside the compartment, behind the filter, was a small, dirty, cloth-wrapped bundle. It was about the size of a shoebox. With a growing sense of dread, Ben reached in and carefully pulled it out. It was a piece of old, stained flannel, tied shut with twine. It was heavy for its size. He placed the bundle on the wet asphalt and, after a moment's hesitation, untied the twine. He unfolded the cloth. Inside were a collection of strange, disturbing objects, a lock of long, dark human hair, tied with a red ribbon, a handful of yellowed, cracked human teeth, a small, hand-carved wooden doll, crudely shaped like a woman, with a rusty nail driven through its chest. and at the bottom of the bundle, a faded black and white photograph of a young woman with sad, dark eyes. On the back of the photo, a single word was scrawled in faded ink. Elise. Ben stared at the bizarre, macabre collection, a cold understanding dawning on him. This was some kind of curse, a hex bag, a piece of old, dark folk magic. Someone had hidden it inside the air intake of his truck. But who and why? He had bought the truck used about a year ago. It could have been there for years, hidden by a previous owner or placed there by an enemy he never knew he had. Acting on pure instinct, he knew he had to get rid of it. He couldn't just throw it in the trash. It felt too malevolent, too powerful. He walked to the edge of the truck stop property, where a small, muddy ditch ran along the fence line. He threw the bundle and all its contents into the ditch, watching as the muddy water swallowed the photo, the teeth, the doll. He walked back to his truck, feeling strangely lighter. He climbed back into the cab. The foul, metallic smell was gone. The air was just cold and damp. He sat in the driver's seat for a long time, listening. There were no more whispers. The presence was gone. Ben never found out the story behind the bundle. He never learned who Elise was or who had packed her memory away with such malice. But he knows that for one terrifying night, her tormented spirit was trapped in the vents of his truck, her desperate whispers a testament to a dark and forgotten crime. The experience taught him that evil can be hidden in the most mundane of places, and that sometimes the most terrifying voices are the ones carried on the air we breathe. Story 5. The passenger in the mirror. The relationship a trucker has with his mirrors is intimate and constant. They are his eyes, his lifeline, his connection to the massive, blind beast of a trailer he pulls behind him. A driver spends thousands of hours staring into these reflective surfaces, learning to interpret every flicker of light, every subtle movement. But what happens when the mirror shows you something that isn't there? Or worse, something that is. Our final story comes from a driver named Rick, and it's about a reflection that didn't belong, a passenger who only existed in the glass. Rick was a flatbed trucker in the mid-2000s, a job that required a special kind of skill and attention to detail. He hauled oversized loads, construction materials, massive machinery, and industrial equipment. On a clear, cold night in 2006, he was driving a particularly difficult route through the winding, hilly back roads of rural Arkansas. His load was a massive, custom-fabricated steel tank, and the route took him off the interstate and onto dark, two-lane county roads. He was navigating a sharp, downhill curve when his chains and binders, the heavy-duty straps holding the tank to, the trailer, made a loud, groaning sound. It was a sound that every flatbedder dreads. It meant the load might have shifted. A shifted load, especially one this heavy, on a road this curvy, was incredibly dangerous. He had to pull over and check it immediately. He found a small gravel pull-off, barely large enough for his rig. The spot was completely isolated, surrounded by dense, dark woods. The only light came from his own headlights and the cold, distant light of the moon. He shut down the engine, the sudden silence amplifying the sound of crickets and the rustles of unseen things in the woods. He grabbed his flashlight and his trusty tire thumper, a heavy wooden club used to check tire pressure, but also a comforting piece of self-defense, and climbed out of the cab. He spent the next 20 minutes meticulously checking every chain, every binder, tightening and adjusting until he was satisfied that the load was secure again. He was about to climb back into his cab when he felt it, the unmistakable, primal feeling of being watched. He froze, his hand on the door handle. He slowly scanned the dark tree line. Nothing. He listened. Only the sounds of the forest. He told himself it was just the isolation getting to him. These backwoods roads could be creepy at night. He shook off the feeling and pulled himself up into the driver's seat. He started the engine, the familiar rumble a welcome comfort. He put the truck in gear and was about to pull out when he did his final mirror check. Left mirror, clear. Right mirror, not clear. In the large, convex passenger side mirror, he saw a person sitting in his passenger seat. Rick's heart leaped into his throat. He whipped his head to the right to look at the actual seat. It was empty. He stared at the empty seat for a long moment, his mind refusing to connect what he was seeing with what he knew to be true. He slowly, cautiously, turned his head back to the passenger side mirror. The figure was still there. It was a man, or at least it had the shape of a man. He was gaunt and pale, dressed in old, tattered clothing that looked like it was from another era. His hair was long and matted, and his face was covered in a thick, dark beard. But his eyes were the most terrifying part. They were wide, wild, and filled with a profound, soul-deep sorrow. And they were staring directly into the mirror, as if he knew that was the only place Rick could see him. Rick's mind was at war with itself. His eyes were telling him the passenger seat was empty. His mirror was showing him a terrifying, sorrowful man sitting right next to him. He felt a cold sweat break out across his entire body. Was this a ghost? A hallucination? A trick of the light? But the image in the mirror was perfectly clear, as solid and real as his own reflection. He had to get out of there. He stomped on the accelerator, pulling his rig back onto the dark road with a spray of gravel. He drove, his eyes flicking manically, between the empty seat beside him and the horrifying figure in the mirror. The man in the mirror never moved. He just sat there, his sad, wild eyes locked on the mirror, a silent, spectral passenger. Rick tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a reflection from something in his cab, a strange play of light and shadow. He turned the cab light on. The passenger seat was undeniably, absolutely empty. But in the mirror, the man was still there, now illuminated by the dome light, his features even clearer, his sorrowful expression even more profound. The light didn't make him disappear. It made him more real. Panic began to set in. Rick started talking to himself, a frantic, whispered monologue. "You're not real. You're not there. I'm just tired. It's just the road." As if in response to his words, the man in the mirror slowly raised a hand. He pointed a long, bony finger, not at Rick, but forward, down the road ahead. Rick, against his better judgment, followed the direction of the pointing finger. Up ahead, the road entered a sharp, blind curve, bordered by a steep, rocky cliff on one side and a sheer drop-off on the other. As he approached the curve, he saw something that made him slam on his brakes. A massive oak tree had fallen, its trunk completely blocking both lanes of the narrow road. It was lying just around the blind curve. If he had been traveling at his normal speed, he would never have seen it in time. He would have smashed directly into it, and the momentum of his heavy load would have likely sent his entire rig plunging over the cliff edge into the darkness below. He sat there, his truck idling just feet from the fallen tree, his body trembling. The ghostly passenger, the man in the mirror, had just saved his life. With a shaking hand, he looked back at the mirror. The man was still there, but his expression had changed. The wildness was gone, replaced by a look of peaceful resignation. He slowly lowered his hand and gave Rick a small, almost imperceptible nod. And then, as Rick watched, the man's image began to fade. He didn't vanish in a blink. He slowly became transparent, like smoke, until the reflection showed nothing but the empty passenger seat and the dark road behind him. He was gone. Rick sat there for nearly an hour, unable to move, his mind trying to process the impossible event. He eventually had to use his CB to call for help, reporting the fallen tree. It took a local road crew hours to clear it. During that time, other truckers who were stopped by the blockage came up to chat. One of them was an old-timer, a local who had been driving these Arkansas back roads for 50 years. Rick hesitant at first, told the old man what he had seen. He expected to be laughed at, to be told he was crazy, but the old trucker just nodded slowly, his face grim. "Sounds like you met the watchman," the old man said, his voice low. "The watchman?" Rick asked. "Local legend," the old driver explained. Story goes that back in the 1950s. A trucker named Silas was driving this very road. His brakes failed on that same downhill curve. He knew he couldn't make the turn. He had his son with him, a young boy, asleep in the passenger seat. Rather than go over the cliff and kill them both, he jackknifed the rig, smashing the cab into the rock wall. He was killed instantly, but the crash was just gentle enough that his son survived without a scratch. The old man looked at Rick, his eyes serious. "They say Silas's spirit still haunts this stretch of road. He's not malicious. He's a guardian. They say he appears in your mirror, a silent passenger to warn drivers of danger ahead. A rock slide, a fallen tree, a patch of black ice. He's the watchman of the woods, still trying to keep other drivers from sharing his fate. You're a lucky man. He only appears to those in real danger." Rick never drove that road again, but he never forgot his silent passenger. He was no longer afraid of what he had seen. He was humbled by it. He had encountered something that defied all logic, a ghostly guardian angel who existed only in the reflection of a mirror. It was a chilling, profound reminder that the world is filled with mysteries and that sometimes, on a dark and lonely road, the things you can't explain are the only things that can save your life.